Hello, everyone. Yesterday, we left off with page 7 in your interactive notebook. This is page 8. You should have done this for homework, so I'm going to key that out first and then get into some notes on cell size. But before we do that, just a quick reminder that we're talking about the cell cycle. And the cell cycle is like talking about a life cycle, right? We've all talked about the life cycle of a butterfly and that type of thing. Part of the life cycle of a cell, the cell cycle, right, is cell division. And remember, cells need to divide to replace themselves, repair damage, and for reproductive purposes. And when I say reproduction, I mean both asexual and sexual reproduction. So we'll get more into that. So first we had you do a little bit of math here, and you were looking at surface areas of cubes versus the volume of cubes, and the volume of cubes. And this issue here, this topic right here, surface area and volume ratio, is very important. I want you to notice the ratios here. When everything else is accounted for, a smaller cell, a cell that is 1 centimeter cubed, has a surface area of 6 to 1 for the volume. As soon as that cell starts getting bigger, right? So now we're talking about a 2 centimeter cubic and a 3 centimeter cube, 3 cubic centimeter cube. Look what happens to that ratio. It goes down. And so what I want you to think about is, what does that mean? Well, the surface area in a cell is the cell membrane, and we know from the cell transport, right, unit, that's where stuff moves in and out of a cell via diffusion and osmosis and different forms of transport. And so I hope it makes sense that the more surface area you have serving every one part of volume is better for getting things in and out of a cell. So one of the reasons cells are small, right, is because of that efficiency. Okay, so take a look over here. You can key this out for yourself. So you have an inverse relationship here. As the cell size increases, the surface area to volume ratio decreases. All right. Moving on then. So the why cells need to divide notes. I kind of indicated that already, but remember, cells are the basic unit of life, and that sounds, whatever. What does that mean, Mr. J? Well, it means a lot. It means that every single one of your cells has the capacity to be you if given the ability to divide, right? In other words, it has the directions to be you. Remember my script analogy, right? Everybody has a script for the play, but you only have to learn your part. Every cell in your body has the entire script to be you. In other words, you could take a skin cell from you, take the DNA out of it, put it into a younger cell, let that cell divide, and it could make another you, right? A clone of you. Okay? So when I say it's the basic unit of life, I really mean, right, it's the blueprint. Every single one of these trillions of cells could become another you. Okay? So in an adult, 60 to 100 trillion cells. A lot of those cells are not our own, right? We're an ecosystem, right? We're made up of bacteria and fungi and viruses and all those other things. But a lot of our volume is in fact made up of our own cells, right? The bigger eukaryotic cells. But realize those all come from a single fertilized egg. So how do we get from that single zygote, that single fertilized egg, to these trillions of cells? Well, cell division, right? And so what is cell division? This is how a cell goes from being one cell to 2 cells, right? A parent cell to 2 daughter cells. But before it can do that, it has to be able to replicate its DNA. Okay, so I want you to think about, again, it's always so important to get into the why of these things. Why do cells need to divide? When Eastridge first opened, we didn't have a senior class, and our classes were a little bit smaller. I don't know the exact numbers, but let's just say we had 1,000 students in the building. We now have close to 2,000, but at the time that Eastridge opened in 2009, we had 1,000 students in the building. But our media center was the same size. So imagine going down to the media center and you need to pick up your textbook for biology class. right? You go down there, it's not going to be that difficult, right? There aren't that many students. The media center is still fairly big compared to the number of students, and you're able to get your book relatively efficiently. Now we've got double the number of students. You go down to the media center and you want to get your book, right? There's twice as many people there putting the same demands on the same media center, right? And that's the same idea with a nucleus. The DNA in a nucleus is constantly being accessed to make cell parts. And you can have a log jam, so to speak, when the cell gets too big and is putting too much pressure on that nucleus. The nucleus can't do its job efficiently, much like our media center. Okay, so that's one major reason. The other major reason I already kind of alluded to is the exchange of material, right? So as a cell increases in size, it needs more food, it needs more oxygen, it needs the ability to eliminate more wastes. And if it has a large volume, but a relatively or proportionally small surface area, it can't get that stuff out, right? So imagine the cytoplasm of a cell being, let's say we're talking about something going from the nucleus to the outside of the cell, right? That distance. That is if that distance continues to expand, it takes that much further for something to diffuse from roughly where the nucleus is, let's say, to the outside of the cell. Okay, so we know that most stuff enters the cell, has to get into the cell from the bloodstream through the cell membrane, and so that's where it's really valuable to have a large surface area in a relatively small volume. That's why cells are so incredibly small. Not just small, but microscopically small. So that the cells don't have to put a lot of energy into getting oxygen or to getting carbon dioxide out, right? It's just the nature of diffusion and osmosis that do that work for them. Moving on here. Um, as the length and the size of a cube increase, so this is the math, I think that you've already done. I'm not going to get too carried away with this. Its volume increases faster than its surface area, and that should make sense, right? Think about it. Volume is cubic, right? Surface area is squared, right? And so one of them is going to increase at a faster rate than the other. If a cell gets too large, the surface area of the cell is not large enough to get enough oxygen and nutrients and waste out, and the cell starts to struggle. So before it gets too large, it divides, right? And it can't divide unless it first doubles its genetic material, because every cell in our body has that full complement of genetic material, our whole genome in it. Other than our red blood cells. Our red blood cells don't have nuclei in them, but every other cell has a full complement of genetic material. So before a cell can divide, it needs to replicate or double up that material. And it shouldn't surprise anybody. There's a bunch of enzymes involved here. A helicase, which cuts the DNA, a polymerase, which puts new DNA back together. We'll get into more of that later. But this is really a form of asexual reproduction. Your cells are cloning themselves, genetically speaking. Sexual reproduction, we'll get more into that later. But I think most of us recognize that in this case, you're fusing two cells together, two different pieces of genetic material together. And there's good and bad, right? That process, number one, requires two, right, individuals. But the bonus is you get genetic variation. And again, we'll get more into that, but if you look here at the advantages and disadvantages, some organisms only produce asexually, right? I don't know, garlic, for instance, or strawberries can reproduce asexually. So things that make clones, exact copies of themselves, that's great because they can make it fast. They don't need another organism to do it. And they're using cell division to do this. There are disadvantages to this, though. If the environment changes dramatically, the whole population has the same sort of genetic thing going on. And so all of it is susceptible to collapse if that happens. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, the advantage if the environment changes, you've got varied genetic material, right? A lot of people argue from an evolutionary standpoint that when the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were coexisting for a while, that the Neanderthals started to struggle when the trees faded away, when the earth warmed and the trees were sort of fading away and the savannas came about. The Cro-Magnons were more suited to that environment. Why? Well, they had different genetic material than the Neanderthals, so there's value to sexual reproduction. Okay, so hopefully you can get through the cell size. You got through the cell size demo lab. This guy ran you through some. We would have done this exact, very similar lab in class. Unfortunately, we don't get to do that. But there's sort of the data that you need. And I'll leave you with this page where you can kind of see if you understood the big ideas. Okay, so the main take-home message is cells need to be small for a couple of different reasons, right? Information overload and the ability to get materials in and out. Those two big things, right? And in order to stay small, they have to undergo cellular division, and we're going to get more into that as we move forward. All right, take care, and we'll see you next time.